The Particular Abilities of Marinette and Her Discovery of Them by Plants Are Fun 06. A Miraculous Ladybug. Batman. Crossover Fanfic. Chapter 4. Part 2. Rules. It had been 4 months since then, since she decided train travel was the best option in her situation. 8 months away from the League, Marinette didn't really believe it. She had been away from the League for 8 entire months. The thought was frightening, and made her feel at peace at the same time. She was currently sitting in a train heading God knows where. She had met some people who spoke English, but they were few and far between. She had long since left any place that had Arabic or Mandarin-speaking folk. Many European languages had words that were very closely related to their English counterparts. She recognized one word in particular, Europa, which took all of 2 seconds to guess meant Europe in whatever language they were speaking. She was guessing German by the accent, but she could be entirely wrong. Marinette knew that traveling from where she had been in Asia to any European country could happen in a matter of days, maybe a couple of weeks to some places when you travel by train. She didn't have any real sense of direction, and knew for a fact that at some point she had been going in circles. But when she brought up the mental image of the world map in her head, it was hard to wrap her mind around the idea of her going across it, though she could be remembering the map wrong. Marinette found that her sight memories had started to fade. It was strange, to say the least. If you had asked her 8 months ago, she would have been able to draw a picture of her grandfather, or Nanda Parbat's garden, or a diagram of any animal. But now, she couldn't remember what they looked like. Her memories were still very clear. She remembered exactly what the lilies on the east balcony smelled like. She could remember all the mathematics she had learned in her academy classes. She could remember the taste of baklava that the maids made for dessert on occasion. But she could remember none of what they looked like. She knew that forget-me-nots had 5 blue petals, but she could not remember what the flower looked like. Marinette could remember the color blue. The memory of forget-me-nots that sat in small vases on the eastern balcony of the northern wing had long since lost its color, you could say, but the memory was still intact. She didn't have any visual recollection of the flower, yet she felt that if she saw forget-me-nots again, she would recognize them in an instant. She kept them in her room, and saw them every day, and she couldn't remember what they looked like. She couldn't even remember what her room looked like. She remembered that the bed was facing the east wall, and was 10 strides from the door, and the dresser was 5 strides from the left of the bed. She could not remember what her room looked like. Not the comforter, not the dresser, not the window view. Nothing. It was strange, to say the least. She retained all of her memory, the way things smelt, the way things tasted, the way things felt, and the way things sounded. But it was as if she could never see at all. Any memory of what sight with eyes dissipated over the 8 months to the point that she couldn't remember it. She was snapped out of her thoughts by the scratchy sound of the intercom coming to life. Nos sommes arrivés à Paris. Merci d'avoir choisi deux bonnes descendants du train entier secret et passives. Une belle journée. It was the same cheery female voice she had heard upon every train before departure and upon arrival. She had started to recognize it as markers for when the train stopped. Her mind had trained to wake up when hearing it. Marinette started to get up from her position. She had been sitting in that curled-up position by the seat of benches for several hours now. She had to stretch out all her sore muscles. She had been so out of it in thought that she hadn't even thought to listen to what the intercom had said to see if she could recognize the name of the city. She didn't always recognize it, but when she did, it was nice to know where she was. She was prepared to leave the train, steal some food from this completely unfamiliar place, where she had no idea the location or name of, and hop right back on the train and leave. Marinette needed to be somewhere people actually spoke languages she understood. Wherever she was, based on the intercom, did not speak a language she knew, or was in an area that spoke Arabic, Mandarin, or English. Marinette seriously doubted that any place in Europe had a population where the majority spoke Arabic or Mandarin. But Marinette was positive there was somewhere that with enough moving around, she would land in a place where most people spoke English. How long it would take to find such a place, Marinette wasn't exactly sure. Her mother's third rule was, always have a plan for every situation, in any condition. Her plan wasn't very solid. She was failing at Mother's third rule as well, but like all of her mother's previous rules, she wasn't sure she could really blame herself. Then again, she had heard of situations her mother had gotten into all the time that were no fault of her own. Yet, she still made herself a plan and managed to complete her mission and get out. So, maybe she was to blame for breaking Mother's third rule. Surprisingly, wherever she was, there was not a lot of street vendors. Marinette guessed from the temperature and the limited number of people walking around that it was night, so the city did have street vendors. So if the city did have street vendors, they were likely closed. Either way, Marinette had been walking around for a while and had found no such luck on the easy grab-and-go of street vendors. So she decided to go back to the train, sneak back on, and wait to the next city and hope for better luck. She had eaten a loaf of bread yesterday, so she would survive. She had gone a lot longer without any food in the last. It really wouldn't hurt to forgo eating for one day. It was only after getting back to the station that she realized something. There were no floating people, and floating people meant train, and she had not been able to see any of the metal or plastic that made up most of the train, but there was always floating people indicating the train was there. She had missed her train. Marinette didn't know what had happened between finding out she missed the train and now. Based on the thin strips of greenery on the ground, those strips all ended at the same two lines. Marinette guessed she was in an alleyway of sorts. She had no idea how she had even found an alley to hide in with her inability to see most metal and rock that made up the buildings here. The only thing she had on her mind was how hard she was crying, her face buried in her arms. She only cried harder when she didn't feel the pressure of cheap plastic against her arms and face, and realized that at some point of her running from the empty train station, she had managed to lose her glasses. She was breaking her own rules. There goes rule 1. She was breathing so heavily that she wasn't taking in any air, and the tears kept pouring and her eyes felt as if they were burning. The rational part of her mind telling her that crying got her nowhere, but dehydrated and hyperventilating to the point of exhaustion was either silent or being ignored in favor of the other side of her mind screaming at her to run, panic, cry. There goes rule 2. Marinette couldn't see anything from being too overwhelmed and could barely hear over the sounds of her own sobs, but she did manage to hear loud footsteps coming up to her. And rule number 3 had been broken. She had been discovered. In a single night, in a span of 30 minutes, she had managed to break every single one of her rules. She calmed down enough till she could see, her head still buried in her arms. She saw 2 people, a man and a woman, crouched down a few feet away from her. Salut peut-être, et si que tu vas bien? Horace, est-tu besoin d'aide? Un sot tes parents? She couldn't understand him. It only made her cry harder. He kept repeating that over and over. Similar phrases, too. She kept crying and crying. She was stuck in some unfamiliar city. She didn't know when the next train was coming. These people couldn't help her. She saw the woman stop the man and then talked for a minute or two. And that's when she heard it. That's when she heard the woman speak. In Mandarin. Can you understand me? Marinette had calmed herself down from tears like this before. It usually took a good amount of time, what felt like hours, but she had never stopped crying as quickly as she did just then, hearing those words leave the woman's mouth. Mandarin. She spoke Mandarin. She raised her head from her arms and straightened her back. She saw how their eyes slightly widened, and how their jaw went slack when they saw her face. But they kept their composure. They still stayed right in front of her, waiting for her to speak. They didn't run. They didn't cry. They didn't say prayers. They didn't think she was a monster. So in that moment, she made a split-second decision. She said a single word that she didn't realize changed the entire course of her life. In Mandarin. Yes.